particularly the essence of the halacha. Rabbi Wolvovsky.
Thank you very much. I want to start by asking if everyone, whoever's able to put on mute, if you could put your screen on mute this way, if there won't be any background noise, it won't disturb. Really appreciate that. Thank you very much. Now let me get to share the screen. Oh. So as we do every week, we're going to be focusing on a sugya in halacha, a topic in halacha that relates to the seder of the week, to the parsha of the week. And as Rabbi Green mentioned, we often go to the essence of the halacha. That's the nefesh halacha, the neshama of the halacha. Now, today we're going to be doing something very different. I mean, we're going to be really learning in the opposite order that we typically do it. We're going to be starting with the essence and then taking that to the halacha. Typically, we start with the halacha and then we sort of dig deeper to find the essence. Tonight, I would like to do it the opposite order. So we start the shir today is based on Likutei Sichos, volume Tes Zayin, volume 16. We start with a passage from Haggadah Shel Pesach, a passage that many of us are familiar with. We read it every year on the night of the Seder. And after we finish most of Magid, we finish most of telling the story. It says after Dayenu. Is it after Dayenu or is it before Dayenu? Anyhow, but we come to this paragraph where we calculate how many miracles did Hashem perform for the Jewish people in Egypt, and then later on at the sea at the Yam Suf. So there are three opinions. Today we're going to be focusing on two. Later we'll bring in the third. But the two opinions are as follows. I'm going to read it and translate it. Rabbi Eliezer says, Minayin, how do we know? Shekol mako maka shehevia kadosh baruch hu al Mitzrim b'Mitzrayim hoysa shel arba makas. How do we know that every plague of the 10 plagues that Hashem brought upon the Egyptians were in fact, each one had 4 plagues to it. It was sort of included 4 in each plague. Shenamar, because we learn from the pasuk. The pasuk says, Yishalach bam charein apai, I will send my anger to them. Evra v'zam v'tzara mishlachas malachei rayim. And he uses 4 descriptions to describe the calamity that will be from Hashem's anger on Mitzrayim, on the Egyptians. And here's where Rabbi Eliezer explains. He says, Evra achas, v'zam shtayim, v'tzara shalos, mishlachas malachei rayim arba. He calculates it. He says, you see, it's 4 different expressions. 4 different expressions means that every makkah, every plague was comprised of 4 different elements. Rabbi Kiva argues. Rabbi Kiva says no. How do we know that every makkah, every plague that was brought upon the Egyptians of the 10 plagues was really comprised of 5 elements? You see, and he uses the very same pasuk. It's interesting, right? Because he used the very same pasuk. He just uses more words of the pasuk. He says, "Yishalach bam charein apai," I will send my anger. And again, the words are Evra, V'zam, V'tzara, Mishlachas Malachei Rayim. And he continues. He says, "Charein apai," my anger. That's number 1. Evra, Shtayim, V'zam, Shalish, V'tzara, Arba, Mishlachas Malachei Rayim. Chamish. You see, if you break it down, there's 5 different descriptions to explain each plague, showing us and teaching us that every plague included 5 different parts to it. What are they arguing about? Are they just arguing? What does it even mean? A plague that's made up of 4 and a plague that's made up of 5. What is their machlokes? We read this every year at the Haggadah. It's interesting math. It is, because then when they come to speaking about, they have to calculate how much that would be 5 times over, because it says that Hashem showed his finger in Egypt and his hand at the sea. So if you're talking about each number here has to be multiplied by 5 in order to explain how, first of all, multiplied by 10 for each one of the 10 plagues, and then multiply that by 5 to understand how many were at the sea. So what are they arguing about? What is it? It's interesting, but what are they arguing about? So there are different answers. Amongst them is the Kolboi. The Kolboi was actually one of the authors of the Tosfos. He's one of the Balei Tosfos. And he writes an answer that he brings from other people. It's also brought in the Ritva, and he explains it like this. He says what they're arguing about is how deep did each Makkah penetrate Mitzrayim? Every Makkah was, as you would say in Yiddish, a zetz. It was a klop. It was a hit. How deep did that hit penetrate? In other words, how much of Egypt was affected by the plague? Either 4 or 5. What's the difference between 4 or 5? We know the Rambam tells us that every single thing, every matter in this world is made up of 4 elements. Eish, ruach, mayim, afer. Fire, wind, water, and earth. That everything in this world, says the Rambam, is comprised of those 4 things. The difference between different materials is how much of each one element they have. So when you say that a makkah, the plague, had 4 elements, like Rabbi Eliezer says, when he's saying 4, he's saying, I want you to know that it wasn't just a plague that hit Egypt. It broke, it shattered, and it really destroyed the 4 elements that made Egypt. That's the way the Kolba explains it. Okay, I know it sounds like I'm starting off with the Chassidus, but this is coming from one of the authors of the Taisus. He says that we started that when Rabbi Eliezer says 4, he means the 4 elements that every material thing, every physical thing is made of. So then what is Rabbi Kiva adding? When Rabbi Kiva says 5, he says no. Not only were the 4 elements in Egypt destroyed, but the 5th element as well. What's the 5th element? So I'll tell you the words in Hebrew that he uses is called the koyach hayuli, which literally means, I think, the primitive energy or the primitive potential, really potential, sayuli, to say the origin of every existence, which is the potential for it to be, the ability for it to be, not what it is, okay? Everything is made up of 4 elements. This 5th level is its very potential to be, its ability to even exist. It's obviously deeper at its core. It's not something tangible. It's sort of the godly permission allowing it to exist. When I say permission, I mean the energy that's allowing it to exist. So Rabbi Kiva says that every makkah, not only did it destroy the 4 elements of every material thing, every physical thing in Egypt, but also the very origin of its existence, the very essence of its existence was also destroyed through the makkah. Beautiful. That's what he answers. Obviously, it's a deep idea, but we're actually going to start building from this, from what we do understand of what he writes. Because obviously, the goal of the makkahs, the goal of the 10 plagues, were to break Egypt, to break the klippa, to break the impurity of Egypt. So then, the machlokes here between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Kiva is really on how deep was the impurity of Egypt. Because if they're arguing how deep the makkah went, they're arguing about that because they have a base argument. And what's the base argument? How deep impure was the Egyptians, and where was Egypt? Where the Egyptian was Egypt? How deep was that impurity? How deep was that tumah? If it was so deep that it was, it included the 4 elements of their existence, then we understand why the makkah has to break through those 4. And if we say the impurity of the Egyptians and of Egypt was even deeper than that, it was the very essence was rotten, then we understand why Rabbi Kiva adds to that no, the makkah had to break that as well. Okay, that is what we're holding now. And this is the idea that we have. We have that either 4 or 5. Was Egypt rotten in its 4 elements, which means basically in its form, in the way it is, in its material, or was it also rotten at the essence? That is the core of the machlokes between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Kiva. Now let's move on to halacha. Now that we have this idea, this germ, we're now going to find it in various places in halacha as it relates to remembering these events on Pesach. You see, this idea of the depth of the impurity of Egypt, the depth of the tumah of Egypt, that it reached to its core. So we find it also in the Isser, in the prohibition of chametz, because the prohibition of chametz is very unique. We know we don't eat chametz. In addition to not eating chametz, chametz is unique that we're not allowed to have pleasure from chametz. We're not allowed to have hana. But there are other prohibitions in the Torah that you're not allowed to have hana, you're not allowed to have pleasure from them. There is in chametz an even deeper thing, that not only are you not allowed to eat it, and not only are you not allowed to have pleasure and gain pleasure from it, it's not allowed to be found, bal yira, bal yimatza. It's not allowed to exist in the possession of a Jew. You see that we treat chametz as something that's so impure to the core. It's not only about its image, it's not only about its form, meaning we eat it, that would be its form. It's material, that's how we appreciate, and have pleasure from it. But even its essence, its very existence is not allowed to be in our homes. That idea that it's not only its form, but it's its essence. Now that we see how it reflects in the prohibition of having chametz and eating chametz, let's move on to the halacha. The halachas of destroying chametz. How does one destroy chametz? So really, if we open up the Mishnah, there are two ways one could destroy chametz. It's a machlokes between Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim. Rabbi Yehuda Omer ein bir chametz ela sreifa. Rabbi Yehuda says to destroy chametz, you want to fulfill the mitzvah of destroying chametz the way the Torah wants you to destroy. There's only one way. How do you destroy it? Through fire, through burning it. That's the only way you could do it. The Chachamim argue. They argue with Rabbi Yehuda. They say no. There are other ways to destroy chametz. What are the other ways? If you crumble the chametz and you throw it to the wind, or you throw the chametz into the ocean, that is also destroying chametz. You don't have to burn it. What are they arguing about? So the Rogachover Glein has a beautiful explanation about this. He says that what they're arguing about is what must be destroyed in the chametz. And I'm going to say it backwards, I'm going to say Chachamim before Rabbi Yehuda. Chachamim would say, what you have to destroy is the ability for a human being to take pleasure from it. You have to completely destroy its form and destroy its material. But Rabbi Yehuda says, no, you have to destroy its essence. You have to burn it. It cannot exist. You see, it's not only that you cannot derive pleasure from it, it cannot exist. That's why you have to burn it, says Rabbi Yehuda. To use the words that the Rogachover uses, he says, the Rogachover guy means the genius of Rogachov. He was the rabbi in Dvinsk, the same time as the Ur Sameach, a very, very special individual. So, and in all these matters of halacha, when he goes into these analyses, he goes very, very deep. And his idea is that, is the chametz a problem in its essence or only in its form? Rabbi Yehuda says the issue with chametz is in its essence. And the Chachamim argue, the Chachamim say, no, it's only in its form. As soon as you destroy the form, you are okay. And this is based on how the reason why they're arguing about how to destroy chametz is because their argument is what is prohibited in the chametz. As I just said, is it its essence or only its form? And this reflects once again the two opinions of Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Eliezer, who told us that every makkah in Egypt, the ones that we're learning in this week's parsha, was made up of four. His opinion is that what had to be destroyed in Egypt was the four elements, not the core, not the essence. Whereas Rabbi Akiva says, no, it's the essence. And that's why when it comes to chametz, we treat it the same way. We destroy not only its image, not only its form, not only its material, but its very essence. Moving further into the halacha, so far we see it in the prohibition of having chametz. We see it in how to destroy chametz. Now we're going to move on to what is forbidden. In what way is it forbidden to have pleasure, to derive pleasure from the chametz? So the Gemara Yerushalmi, right? We have the Gemara, the Talmud Bavli, Talmud Yerushalmi. So the Talmud Yerushalmi brings a machlokes. Machlokes is if a person is allowed to take chametz on Pesach and feed it to a dog. Now their own dog, they're obviously not allowed to, because that would mean you're deriving pleasure, because instead of feeding it, I don't know, dog food from PetMark, you're giving it your own PetMark. Is that what it is? PetSmart. I don't know what the store is, but something like that. Instead of giving them something that it's a mitzvah, so it's an obligation as something your own property, you have to feed the dog. So then it would obviously be considered pleasure if you're allowed to give the dog chametz, because you're not allowed to eat it and you're giving it to the dog. How about if you feed a stray dog, an ownerless dog, to use the words that the Gemara uses, a dog of hefker? A dog of hefker, you see a dog of hefker, you say, oh, wow, the dog is hungry, let me give it a slice of bread. Now, it's Pesach, chametz you're not allowed to, but all right, so the Gemara, you're not allowed to have it. So if the Gemara asks, the Gemara Yerushalmi asks, are you allowed to give the bread to an ownerless dog? You're not benefiting directly from it. You're actually, in a sense, not benefiting at all from it. So are you allowed to do that? And the Gemara there brings two opinions. Some say you are, some say you are not. And what is their argument? What's the core of their argument? What are they arguing about? They're arguing about, once again, what pleasure is forbidden from chametz. Just like we spoke about what is forbidden in the chametz, what has to be destroyed in the chametz, they're arguing about what pleasure is forbidden to be derived from the chametz. Is it pleasure that leads to eating? Which, by the way, that's the way most people see it. That's the way Rashi and Gemara, he says, you're not allowed to have pleasure from chametz. You know why? Because most pleasure leads to eating. Maybe not directly. Maybe, if you sell it, you're going to get money, and with that money, you're going to buy food. So it's not eating the chametz, eating in general. By most forms of pleasure, Rashi says, I know that you could analyze this point and go deeper into it, but this is the way Rashi understands it, and many Mefarshim agree with that the prohibition of deriving pleasure from chametz, it's to derive pleasure from chametz, since it's going to lead you one way or another to something of eating. That's one way of seeing it. Or there's another way. No, chametz is so forbidden. It's forbidden to such an extent that you're not allowed to have any use from it. Not only pleasure that leads to eating, but any form of use. And therefore, even a stray dog, even a dog of hefker, an ownerless dog, you would not be allowed to feed that dog this food that is forbidden, the food of chametz. And in other words, I want to explain it like this, because I used this term earlier, and I believe that this is the best way to see all cases coming together. Is the prohibition, when it comes to chametz, only regarding what is of use for a person? Or, in other words, that people should not be able to appreciate it, people should not be able to enjoy it? Or is the very chametz itself forbidden? And if the chametz itself is essentially forbidden and prohibited, then it has to be destroyed completely, and you're not allowed to use it at all, even to give it to a stray dog. Now, it's interesting to point out, because I mentioned earlier that in the Haggadah, although we are describing the two opinions of Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Kiva, Rabbi Eliezer, who saw the impurity of Egypt reaching the four elements of their existence, but not their very essence, whereas Rabbi Kiva says, no, they were so rotten, Egypt was rotten to its core, to its essence, and therefore every makkah had to include not four, but five, meaning not only the four elements that comprise each material object, but also its very existence, its very essence. So in addition to that, there's a third opinion. It's actually the simplest opinion, and that is Rabbi Yossi Aglili. Rabbi Yossi Aglili actually says that no, every makkah was just 10 makkahs. There were only 10 makkahs. Every makkah was just one. What's interesting to point out is that Rabbi Yossi Aglili, who says he doesn't calculate 4, he doesn't calculate 5, he just goes 10 makkahs. That's it. That's what there were. There were only 10 plagues. In his opinion, in halacha, a person is allowed to have pleasure from chametz. Obviously, that's not the halacha that we follow. But in his opinion, in the Gemara, Rabbi Yossi Aglili holds that chametz mutter bahana. That's his opinion. which obviously so clearly reflects the way we understand it. That what would make something usher in ana, what would make something forbidden to have pleasure from it, if it's impure beyond its form, it's impure in its material, it's four elements, like Rabbi Eliezer would say. Rabbi Eliezer says no, chametz in Mitzrayim wasn't, rotten to that extent. Chametz is not rotten to that extent. Chametz is not impure and prohibited that deep to go beyond its form as it is now. In other words, to eat it. I do want to just make one important footnote, which is that obviously even Rabbi Yossi Aglili, who says that chametz, you're permitted to have hana from it, you're permitted to derive pleasure from it. Obviously, the Torah itself says that bal yirah, bal yamatz, it shouldn't be found in the house, which would have to be explained. I don't want to get caught up in that, but the fact is that what we want to get from Rabbi Yossi Aglili is that we see that the opinion that holds that every makkah was just one makkah, just one plague, also holds that chametz is permitted, is mutar ba'ana. It's permitted to have, we are permitted to have pleasure and derive pleasure from chametz. Now, moving along is that the above mentioned understanding of the opinions of Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva will also shed light on another interesting point, another interesting matter. The Gemara and the Medrash speak often of the nations of the world that have subjugated the Jewish people. And the Medrash, the Gemara often, and Rashi also in Chumash, refers to them as the Arba Galius, the four exiles. The four exiles. But we'll find something very interesting. If you open up the Medrash, open up the Gemara, you'll see there's something very inconsistent with these four exiles. How to calculate the four? In some cases, they count Bavel, Edom, Paras. Sometimes they include Mitzrayim, and sometimes they don't. Most times, Mitzrayim is not calculated as one of the four gullies, the four exiles, and the nations that subjugated the Jewish people, which is very strange. Why wouldn't Mitzrayim be calculated? Obviously, Mitzrayim is the one that we all know about, the one that we celebrate the Exodus from Egypt. So then, why is Mitzrayim in most cases not calculated amongst the four gullies, amongst the four exiles? So the answer that's given, and this answer is given actually by the Arizal, it's a Kabbalistic answer to understand the difference between Mitzrayim and the other nations. So he explains it like this. The Arizal often does this. He speaks about different things and how they are reflected and expressed in Hashem's name. Hashem's holy name of Yud Ke Vav Ke, Yud, Hey, Vav and a Hey. And he says that the four gullius, the four exiles, correspond to the four letters of Hashem's name. What does that mean, practically speaking? So I just want to explain it. These are my own words that to explain the teaching of the Arizal. So number one, every exile is an affront. It's an objection to Hashem's name, to Hashem's revelation. Because what's the definition of exile? Is that we're living in a time that there isn't a divine revelation. So every exile is an affront to Hashem's name. And that's what it means, each letter corresponding to a different one. In addition, each exile gives us the ability to connect to Hashem in a different way. So it's not only about the affront, but also giving us the ability to connect to Hashem on a different level. And so he says that the four exiles correspond to the four levels of Hashem's name, four letters of Hashem's name. And then he says Mitzrayim, however, is a different category. Egypt, he says, is not hinted in the four letters of Hashem's name. It's hinted, this is an expression that the Arizal uses in several cases, in the Koitzoi Shel Yud, which means the point of the Yud of Hashem's name, right? Because when you look at a Yud, the way it's written in the Torah, has like a point, like a not a crown. It has a spitz, you would say in Yiddish, a spitz on the top of the Yud of Hashem's name. So he says, it's not the Egypt, Mitzrayim wasn't just an affront to Hashem's name, to Hashem's revelation. It was an affront and it was an objection to the essence of Hashem. So that's how deep sort of the tumah, the impurity of Egypt was. And now that we understand it that way, and we understand how it reflects in Halacha, and how Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva are arguing about how much of Egypt had to be eradicated and had to be purified. We can now understand why some Midrashim do include Mitzrayim, but most don't. Most don't because Mitzrayim was another category. Egypt was another category. Its impurity was so deep that it's not calculated amongst the other four. The other four was an impurity that that reaches the four letters of Hashem's name. It reaches the form, the material, but not the essence. Whereas the subjugation and the exile of Egypt was an impurity that reached the core. By the way, to emphasize this point, that to strengthen this point, it's brought in multiple places. Rashi also hints to it, that the Jewish people were in such a state of impurity when they were liberated and freed from Egypt, that Hashem would have waited even one more minute. That's what the Gemara uses the expression, even one more moment, it would have been left. It would have been too late because their impurity would have overcome them and would have, sort of possessed them completely. That's the way it's explained. In any case, the reason why we see that Mitzrayim, that Egypt, in most cases is not calculated amongst the four, is because Mitzrayim, as we are gathering from everything we learned tonight, is a different category. It's a different level of impurity, a much deeper and more intense level of impurity, which is what brought Rabbi Akiva to say that every makkah needed to be made up of 5. A 4 was not strong enough. It needed to be made up of 5, meaning to completely undo Mitzrayim from its core, Egypt from its core. So before we go on to the next part, which is really to see how this idea reflects in our service to Hashem, our avodas Hashem, I want to summarize what we did so far. We realize that the number 4 and number 5 that Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva are arguing about is not just a number. It's an understanding of what was needed to take place with Egypt. Was it that that the makkos, that the plagues had to purify and to, in a sense, break Egypt from the 4 elements that comprised every material thing? Or Rabbi Akiva says, no, it had to go even deeper than that. And then we saw how that reflects in Halacha. It reflects in the prohibition of owning chametz. That was the first thing we said as an introduction. Then we went further. We saw a machlokes between Rabbi Yehuda and Chachamim on what has to be destroyed of the chametz. Does it have to be destroyed from human consumption, or must it be destroyed, essentially destroyed, completely destroyed, utterly destroyed, according to the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, which is why he says that it has to be done through fire, through burning. Then we saw the machlokes in the Gemara Yerushalmi, if you're allowed to feed chametz to a dog, an ownerless dog, and we saw the same thing being reflected. Is it that it's not allowed to be enjoyed by people, or is it not allowed to be of any use because it's impure, it's invalid, and it's prohibited at its essence, at its core? Let's move on to the avodas Hashem and what this teaches us in our service of Hashem. We know that it's a mitzvah to remember the exodus of Egypt every single day. It's a mitzvah every single day to remember it. We remember it in Shema, remember it in other places as well. In davening. What does it mean to remember leaving Egypt? In addition to the physical liberation and exodus from Egypt, leaving Egypt has another meaning as well. Mitzrayim represents, the word Mitzrayim, which translates as Egypt, also comes from the word Mitzarim, limitations. We all have limitations, every one of us. Natural limitations, self-imposed limitations, where a person says, I'm comfortable with this, I'm not comfortable with that. This is what I do, this is what I don't do. This is what I learn, this is what I don't study. These are the mitzvahs I'm careful with, these are the ones I'm not so careful with. We all have our limitations. Yetzias Mitzrayim, to be freed from Egypt, to be liberated from Mitzrayim, means to break free of those limitations. We have to remember that every day of our life, because the truth is, as a Jew, it's incumbent upon us. We are obligated to constantly grow and find areas in our life where we must sort of what they would say push the limits and to break new boundaries. So I was comfortable in doing A, B, and C. Now it's time to go beyond that. That's what Yetzias Mitzrayim means. That's what it means to remember leaving Egypt every single day. That's what it means to live it every day. The question is, and Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Kiva are arguing on this question, how deep must our Yetzias Mitzrayim be? How much are we expected to ask of ourselves to break free? Rabbi Eliezer says we have to break our form, our material. What does it mean to break our form and our material? It means we have to break, number one, our actions. Actions include our thought, our speech, our actions. Go a little deeper, our emotions, our mentality. But this is all our form and our chaimer and our material. In other words, these are the four elements, sort of the spiritual elements that we are comprised of. But then Rabbi Kiva adds, and Rabbi Kiva adds, says, no, we can also break free of the very essence of our nature. We have the ability to change even beyond what we could imagine we could change. In other words, when we speak about Yetzias Mitzrayim and breaking free and reaching and connecting to Hashem on a new level, it's not only I think is what, if I want to put it, the terms I want to use now, or maybe are really my own terms. Rabbi Kiva is saying it's not only small changes, it's not only minor changes, and we could tweak this and tweak that. A person has the ability to completely break free of even the essence of their nature. 5 makkahs. Every makkah was made up of 5, means that we could break not only the 4 elements that were, that our form and our image is made up of, which, as I said before, spiritually that will mean our actions, our thoughts, our speech, our emotions, our mentality, but also our very core, Rabbi Kiva says. And here's the punchline. Rabbi Kiva lived a life like that. Rabbi Kiva, his own life, lived this way. You see, starting with the fact that Rabbi Kiva was a descendant of Gerim, of converts. Rabbi Kiva's family, the Gemara, it's not clear if it was his grandfather, his great-grandfather, but it was most likely it was his grandfather. His grandfather was not born Jewish. Rabbi Kiva's grandfather was born not Jewish, and he converted. He became a ger tzedek. And Rabbi Kiva sees that in himself. Rabbi Kiva says, you see, you could completely break free of the essence of your nature. That is really the idea of what a ger is. In addition, I think this also reflects throughout Rabbi Kiva's life. Rabbi Kiva's life, as we know, he didn't start learning until he was 40. His whole life was a life of, you might want to say struggle, but a struggle in always Yetzias Mitzrayim, always breaking free of the limitations that were of yesterday and the limitations of today. And tomorrow I'm going to break free of the limitations of today. Always looking for more students. And when unfortunately his students passed away, he looked for more students to break a new frontier. And Rabbi Kiva says that's really what he lived, and that's what he stood for. And he says that's the type of Yetzias Mitzrayim we could all live. So to summarize, we started by understanding on a deeper level what's the difference between saying if each makkah was made up of 4 like Rabbi Eliezer or 5 like Rabbi Kiva, and we quoted the Kolbai who says that it depends on how much of Egypt had to be destroyed. Was it the 4 elements or its very essence? We understood that obviously if that's what they're arguing about how deep the impurity of Egypt was. And based on that, we were able to see how this reflected in multiple halachas. Number 1, in the machlokes of Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim of how chametz should be destroyed. Must it be through fire, or could it also be through destroying it, breaking it apart, or throwing it into the water? Is it only that we're trying to avoid human consumption, or is it that the very essence of the chametz is forbidden, as the Rogatchover Gaon explains it? And that obviously reflects Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer holds like the Chachamim that says it's only the image and the form of the chametz that's prohibited, but not not its essence. Which, by the way, I do want to add something right here, which I didn't say earlier. It's interesting to note that Rabbi Akiva does hold, like Rabbi Yehuda, that the only way of destroying chametz is with fire. We do, which would perfectly align the two opinions. Rabbi Akiva, who holds that there had to be 5 makas to completely eradicate the impurity of Egypt, and Rabbi Yehuda, who says you have to destroy the chametz through fire, are actually, they both agree with each other. We then went on to visit the machlokes in the Yerushalmi of feeding a dog chametz, and we said that machlokes, if you're allowed to or not, is based on how strong and how deep is the prohibition of chametz. Is it only that a person is not allowed to enjoy from it, or is it not allowed to have, we're not allowed to have any use of it, including also giving it to a dog of hefker? We added at that point that it's interesting to point out that Rabbi Yossi Aglili, the opinion who holds that there were 10 makas, he doesn't go into the 4, doesn't go into the 5, he just says the 10 that the Torah says, starting in this week's parsha, that he is actually of the opinion that says that you're allowed to have hana, you're allowed to have pleasure from chametz. Why? Because he looks at chametz not as something that is prohibited to the core, or prohibited even to the material, but rather it's only prohibited in its very form that it is now, which is that it's not allowed to be eaten. We then realized how this would also explain why many times Mitzrayim is not calculated amongst the other gullius, amongst the other exiles, because Mitzrayim was another category. Mitzrayim is a category of deep, deep impurity, which needed not 4 but 5 to be eradicated, as Rabbi Akiva says. We concluded with seeing how this reflects in our Yetzias Mitzrayim, in our exodus from Mitzrayim, which means that to break free of limitations. The Rabbi Eliezer says that we're expected to break free on all the levels of our nature. And Rabbi Akiva says the truth is, a Jew has the ability of breaking free even beyond that. And in Rabbi Akiva's own life, that was very clearly reflected, because being a descendant of Gerim, as well as in his own life, his own struggles, we see someone who was able to break free completely, even of the essence of his very nature. So I want to say thank you to everybody for joining together and coming together to learn, and looking forward to Mitzvah Shem to come together next week.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank
very
you
much.
so much.
Thank you.